I was born in 1940 in Clinton, North Carolina, a small town in the eastern part of the state.
Tell us about your family and growing up.
Well, I'm an only child. My father ran a fish market in Clinton. Loving parents. Neither had ever had any formal education. Both very strongly believed in education. And believed in education and hard work. And it was clear to me from being a small kid, the way to please my parents is to study hard and to work hard. So that meant jobs in the summer and after school and trying to earn a few pennies.
What kind of jobs did you have?
Excuse me?
What kind of jobs did you have?
Well, my family, both my father and mother, had grown up on the farm, a farm, and my relatives were farmers. So I worked on the farms in the summer, in tobacco, harvesting tobacco, picking cotton, picking cucumbers and peppers in the spring. And I also worked in my dad's fish market.
Wade, tell us how you got interested in broadcasting and about your first job in radio.
Well, I was starting in the 6th grade. I was in a country music band with 2 of my classmates.
What was the name of the band?
Jack Butler and his Playmates. And that was before Hugh Hefner changed the definition of the term playmate. And we played around town, and we played at the local radio station and at various radio stations throughout the state, and television stations in Raleigh and Wilmington and Greenville. And I got interested in broadcasting as a result of that. And thought, well, if I don't make it as a country music artist, maybe broadcasting would be a good profession.
So what was your first job in broadcasting?
Well, my first job was at my hometown radio station working as a disc jockey.
What were the call letters there?
WRRZ.
So you were WRRZ in Clinton.
Right.
And you were a DJ. What shift did you work?
Whenever they needed someone, I would work on Sunday mornings and sometimes after school and sometimes on Saturdays. And then I got a job, a full-time job in the summer in high school and worked several summers.
So what kind of music did you play?
Well, this was the old days of radio, at so-called block programming. It was the only radio station in town, and the station played a little bit of country, a little bit of rock and roll, a little bit of gospel, a little bit of pop. So I would play whatever the shift called for that I was working.
So what year would you have been in school when you started working with the radio station?
It was somewhere about 1954, 55.
So you were 15, 16?
15, 16.
Junior in high school?
Yes.
Great. So then you decided you wanted to go to college.
Yes.
And tell us about that. How did you choose where you were going, and what path did you take?
Well, I had always thought it would be interesting to be a lawyer. But I thought it'd be more interesting to be a musician. But I never thought Nashville really was a real option. And my senior year, I was one of those people fortunate enough to make good grades in school ever since the kindergarten. And my high school counselor advised me to apply for scholarships, academic scholarships. So I applied for one at UNC to major in broadcasting. It was given by Jefferson Pilot Broadcasting, which at that time, among other things, owned WBT and WBTV in Charlotte. And knock on wood, I was fortunate enough to win the scholarship to UNC.
You got a scholarship from Jefferson Pilot to go to school at UNC Chapel Hill. Dream come true.
Yes.
And what did you study?
Well, I studied broadcasting and got a BA degree.
What year did you enter UNC?
The fall of 1954.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. The fall of 58.
58. All right. So you were 17 or 18 years old at that point.
Yeah, I was 18.
18. So you entered UNC Chapel Hill at age 18. And tell us about your going to UNC Chapel Hill. What did you think when you came on campus?
Well, I thought it was a beautiful campus. I was a Tar Heel fan. I always thought it would be fun to be a naval officer. So I applied for the Navy ROTC and passed everything but the colorblind test, and was told I could not be in the ROTC because I had a colorblind deficiency in certain shades of green, which was a surprise, complete surprise and shock.
You had no idea?
To me. I had no idea. That was a real disappointment the first 2 weeks of school. But it was a bit of a motivator by the same token. And I had been told if you really wanted to be in broadcasting, you ought to go over to UNC TV and WUNC Radio and apply for a job. So I did at both places.
And who was in charge at UNC Radio and TV? Who did you speak with? Do you remember?
Well, the general manager of WUNC Radio was a student, a senior. His name was Jack Mayo. And I applied for an announcing position. And I wasn't qualified for it. The radio station at that time strictly played classical music. And I can remember auditioning in the studio and seeing two students through the glass in another studio laughing at me. Needless to say, I didn't get the job, but it too was a motivator. And I went over to UNC TV and applied for a job doing anything. And I got a job as a cameraman. And that's where I first met Carl Venters, in fact. He had graduated from UNC and had been in the Marine Corps for 2 years and had come back working as a producer at UNC TV. And I was working for him. And then as time passed, I got different jobs at UNC TV. I was a continuity writer. I'd write station promos. And then I got a job as I kept practicing on my reading and would read the newspaper in my room to practice reading newscasts. And I got hired as an announcer at UNC TV, a booth announcer. And then I got a job as a news reporter for UNC FM and became news director at WUNC FM.
And while you were the news director at WUNC FM, you had a famous visitor come by.
Well, it was at that time the Kennedy-Nixon presidential campaign was taking place, and Jack Kennedy came to North Carolina.
And he didn't actually come to Chapel Hill where you saw him. Tell us where you saw him and what happened.
Well, he came to Raleigh, so I drove over to the Raleigh-Durham airport and met him along with all the other reporters on the tarmac when his plane landed. And then we all followed his car to Reynolds Coliseum. It's a caravan down Glenwood Avenue, Highway 70. And he spoke at R.J. Reynolds. And when his speech was over, all the reporters rushed the stage, the platform, to try to secure an interview. Well, the security guards were pushing everybody back, and I got lucky and slipped right past them. I guess I didn't look like a reporter. And I got on the platform, and I had my tape recorder over my shoulder and a microphone and a trench coat. And I caught his eye, and I pointed to the mic. And he looked at me and winked and said yes. And he worked his way over to where I was, and I interviewed him. I asked him, I'm not sure, 3 or 4 questions. And that was very exciting for me. I got in my car and drove back to UNC FM and went in the studio and did a report on President Kennedy's visit to North Carolina.
And at this time, it was candidate Kennedy. He was running for president.
Well, that's right. He wasn't president.
Yeah.
Yes.
But he ended up being...
He was Senator. He was Senator Kennedy.
Made your interview even more interesting when the election results were in and you had actually interviewed the president.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, that was pretty exciting.
Wow. So Wade, at UNC Chapel Hill, you got a job at UNC TV, and they weren't public television, they were UNC TV. This was before public television?
No, it was public television.
It was public television. Okay, so
yes.
There was a period of time that they were not public television, but it was public television. There was no PBS
No, they were always
network.
public
Always
television.
public television. Okay. And then you got the job as the news director at the radio station.
Correct.
And tell us what happened after that. Were you liking being in the broadcast?
Well, yes, I enjoyed the business and was looking forward to a career in the business. But I thought, again, it'd be fun to be a lawyer and be a media lawyer in particular. Maybe have the best of both interests. So I went to law school at Chapel Hill, at UNC. And I asked that year in the law school if someone could suggest the name of a media lawyer, communications lawyer in Washington that I might write and try to secure a summer job. And I was given the name of Frank Fletcher. So I wrote Mr. Fletcher a letter, closed my bio, and he wrote back and suggested I come up for an interview, which I did.
And that was in Washington, D.C.?
Washington, D.C.
Now, was Frank Fletcher any relation to the Fletchers that were involved in broadcast facilities in Raleigh?
Yes, his father was A.J. Fletcher, the owner of WRAL.
At that time?
At that time.
In fact, I think, didn't they put him on the air? Was Mr. Fletcher there that put RAL on the air?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So Frank was his son, and he was a broadcast attorney or an attorney in Washington, D.C., and you went to Washington, D.C. to interview with him.
Correct.
What happened?
Well, I was lucky. They offered me a job. So I joined them that summer after the first year of law school.
So you were an intern?
Yes.
But it was a paid internship, thank goodness.
Correct.
Great. So, great opportunity. Summer off, go work in a law office in Washington, D.C.
Yeah,
Wow. How'd
playing
that
in
go?
the majors.
How did that go?
It went great. The money was awful. I lived in a basement unair conditioned basement apartment down in Georgetown. Had a great time though.
That's kind of rough in Washington, D.C. The gets a little warm there in the summers, doesn't it?
Very warm and very humid.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I was young and you don't get sidetracked too much by that stuff.
So, what happened that summer while you were working? What did you learn? What did you take away from that?
Well, I got real excited about the practice of law and communications law in particular. And
what year would that have been?
that was the summer of '63.
All right. So you've been to law school 1 year. In the summer of '63, you do an internship with an attorney, Frank Fletcher, in Washington, D.C., who happens to be the son of A.J. Fletcher, who owns WRAL-TV.
Correct.
Great. So then you come back for your second year of law school.
Correct.
Tell us about that.
Well, it was just another year of law school, a real grind, study, and I was fortunate enough to receive an invitation to go back to the firm for the second summer, which I did. I had a great time, enjoyed it, liked the lawyers, liked the firm, and loved the practice. And they offered me a permanent job.
Wow. So the summer of '64, you go back, and they're impressed with what you do, and you have an opportunity to go to work in Washington, D.C.
Correct.
Wow.
That was real exciting.
How'd your parents think about that?
They were not in favor of it. My dad was sort of indifferent about it, but my mother was very opposed to my going to Washington. Thought it was too far. Didn't understand why I had to go to Washington to practice law.
But you did.
But I did.
Okay. What did you, when you went to work for Fletcher, what kind of cases were you handling?
Well, we represented radio stations, television stations, cable TV systems.
Did you have any cases that related to North Carolina? Did Mr. Fletcher's son, did he do the work for WRAL?
He did, yeah, and we represented WRAL and a large number of broadcasters in North Carolina.
So you go to work for them, you graduated from law school, passed the bar exam, and you become an attorney with, what was the name of his law firm?
Fletcher, Heald, Rowell, Kenahan, and Hildreth.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And so that was in 1964 or 65?
Well, I graduated in '65, so I joined them in the fall of '65.
So when did you meet Sandy?
A couple of years later, in Washington, I had an acquaintance call me to say that he was going to be in Washington and would like to have lunch if I was available. So we had lunch, and he told me of a couple of people I should get to know who were news people and would be in the media business and would need a lawyer one day. And I wrote their names down and put it in my wallet. And I didn't call them, but one of them called me and said our mutual friend, but I can't even remember his name now, suggested we ought to get together and have lunch. I said, yeah, I've been planning to call you. So he and I got together. I never will forget. He said, you want me to come downtown or you want to come down here on the hill and have lunch? And I distinctly recall saying, oh, well, you got a lot more pretty girls down where you work than we do up here. So I went down there and we had lunch in the Senate dining room. And we walked back up to the senator's office. And I was standing in the doorway saying goodbye to him. And a group of girls walked in.
And what senator's office was it that you were standing at?
It was Strom Thurmond
Okay.
from South Carolina. So he introduced me to all of the girls, and I went back to the office, and about a half hour later or so, I called him and said, "Remember that blonde that came in when we were standing there in the office?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "What was her name?" And he said, "Sandy Dunaway." And I said, "Well, would you mention to her that I'm going to call her later this afternoon, ask her out, and tell her that I'm honorable and not some screwball?" And he said, "Oh, I'll be glad to, Wade." So I called her later the afternoon, asked her out, and we went out. We went to a movie, our first date. And then we kept dating, and we're married 2 years later.
So what did Sandy do at the senator's office?
She worked in the legislative section.
So she was involved in government work, and you were an attorney in town, and you met because your association with someone in that office.
Yes.
Great. So how long did you work for Mr. Fletcher in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I was having a great time. Sandy and I were having a great time. We were enjoying Washington, both being from small towns. Washington was exciting. The senator would get, and Nixon was president. Thurman was invited to the White House with regularity and to all kinds of embassy parties. Every dictator in the world have a party in Washington would invite Thurman. And when he couldn't go, he would often give the invitation to his staff members. So Sandy got a lot of those. So I wasn't making any money. Young lawyers weren't paid anything in those days. And I'd pick Sandy up on a Thursday night, and we would go to an embassy party and eat roast beef and boiled shrimp and have good liquor, and then go back to her apartment and watch television. It was pretty exciting.
So how did you ever get back to North Carolina? You were having a great time in Washington, and Sandy's work was there, your work was there. What happened?
Well, I received a telephone call one day from, I believe, from Jack Lee, who was then president of NCAB, telling me that the NCAB board had pretty much decided that the association needed to step up its government relations presence. And several people had suggested that the association hire me to be its executive director and general counsel, and wanted to know would I be interested in moving back to Raleigh and taking that position. And I said, "Well, Jack, I'm flattered that you called. It's a real honor to be considered. I frankly like practicing law and don't want to be a trade association executive, but if I could do this as part of my law practice, I would be very interested in talking." He said, "Well, actually, I think you can." Jack was from Nebraska. He said, "Good friend of mine is a lawyer back home, and he worked in Washington, and he represents the Nebraska broadcasters and serves as its executive director." So he said the board is meeting in Hendersonville on a weekend, and if you'll fly down and meet with the board, I believe you'll get an offer. So I talked to Sandy. Sandy said, yes, I'd be willing to go back. We both really began to appreciate what a wonderful place Raleigh is to live when we went back to Washington. Washington was fun as a single person, but as a married person, you get to thinking about having a home and schools and children and all that stuff. And Raleigh just had a lot more to offer. The upshot of it is I flew down to Hendersonville, interviewed the board. Carl Vetters was a part of that. I received an offer, and I accepted. And Sandy and I moved back to Raleigh in July of 1970. So we'd only been back to Washington about 6 months. But we moved back, and I opened a law office, and I had one client, and that was the NCAB.
So let's back up for a minute. So while you're in Washington, D.C., you still, on weekends and things, made some visits to Raleigh. You had a good friend you'd met in law school, and you enjoyed coming here for basketball and things. So in between, you were coming here.
Yes. One of my best friends is a lawyer named Wade Smith. And he and I talked about practicing law together. He had a small firm with one of my old fraternity brothers and his younger brother. And Wade was a criminal defense lawyer and had urged me to come and join them. Well, I didn't have a client, so I didn't think that would make a lot of sense. And they didn't have a lot of excess business, certainly not stuff that I'd be interested in.
And before that, Jack Lee had contacted you about the government relations job and executive director for NCAB. He'd reached out to you one time before about an issue that NCAB had that you became involved in. Tell us about that.
Oh, yes, he did. When I was the first time I moved to Raleigh, we skipped over that. We didn't actually discuss that, but in the fall of 1968, I received word that a fine law firm in town had lost a young lawyer who had joined the U.S. Attorney's Office. And so I called them and asked them about that position. I came down and interviewed them and received an offer to join them. And that was Maupin, Taylor, and Ellis. And it was a 4-person law firm, but an old-line Raleigh corporate, blue-chip corporate firm.
So what kind of work were you doing there?
Well, I was doing whatever I was asked, insurance defense work, real estate, general litigation, corporate, and enjoyed them very much, but I wasn't getting any media work.
Not really the cases you wanted to handle.
Excuse me?
Not really the cases that you wanted to handle.
Right.
And didn't Jack Lee reach out to you about an issue that they had? Was that while you were working at Maupin, or was that before that?
No, it was when I was at Maupin, Taylor, and Ellis.
Tell us about that.
He called me one day, and I honestly don't remember if it was Jack or Carl Vetters who called me about that. But basically, he said, Wade, a bill that's been introduced in the legislature in both the Senate and House that is very troubling to the broadcasters, and we would like to retain you to help us defeat that bill. And the bill would basically abolish, believe it or not, abolish truth as a defense in an action for libel or slander. So,
and how did this come about? Why did this bill even surface in the legislature?
Well, we were all told that the reason that it was introduced, that a newspaper over in the Charlotte area, either in Rockingham or Hamlet or somewhere over there, had written an article accusing the senator and the representative of taking money from the state, wrongfully taking money from the state. And this bill was introduced. It was a retribution bill.
And by a retribution bill, tell us what that means.
Well, it was to send a message to the media. Be careful what you write. Make sure it's true. And by the way, don't say anything bad about people in government.
And if this bill would have passed, and I were a newspaper or a television station or a radio station and did a story, and I was sued for libel, what would the consequence of that been?
Well, even if the story were true, in every respect, you would lose the lawsuit.
Because the truth
It's not a defense.
would not have been a defense. And that was the bill that was in front of the legislature.
Yeah.
And that was the bill that they hired you to defeat. Well, at the same time, weren't you meeting with a group weekly, kind of a coffee club group in Raleigh, where you met some people that you might not have known otherwise?
Well, yeah, I was meeting with a bunch of lawyers. We get together and have coffee.
But you also met a guy that was on the air by the name of Jesse Helms.
Yes, actually, I had met the senator when I was in Washington doing work for WRAL. The senator was running hard-hitting, controversial editorials in those days.
So his job then was an employee at WRAL, and he did editorials.
He did editorials, and he was program director. And he was drawing a lot of FCC complaints from people who were unhappy about his editorials.
So when you were hired to defeat the bills, one in the House and one in the Senate, that would pass a law that the truth could not be used as a defense for libel, what did you do?
Well, as I said, I had never set foot in the state legislative building, but I had the distinct feeling that the last thing that the legislators would want is a lecture from a young city lawyer.
Big you.
Being me. So I asked Senator Helms if he would accompany me to the public hearing and speak in opposition to the bill.
But he wasn't Senator Helms at that time. He was
a
WRAL announcer,
Yeah,
right?
he was Mr. Helms.
Mr. Helms, Jesse Helms.
And he agreed, and he did. And we killed the bill.
So he went and spoke to the legislature about the harm that this would do, and it went away.
And I drafted position papers showing that it was unconstitutional, and they had all of that. And I met with the legislature's lawyers, and every one of the lawyers said, "Wade, we completely agree with you, but these guys, they don't care about that. They're going to do what they want to do."
So after you got this defeated, what did Jack Lee and Carl Venters and the other broadcasters think about that?
Well, they were very pleased, understandably, and the nice thing about that is we were able to do it and do it quickly and efficiently and inexpensively, relatively inexpensively.
And then a short time after that, you were working at the law firm in Raleigh at that time, correct?
Right.
But you decided to go back to Washington, D.C.
Correct.
Tell us about that.
Well, I just wanted to get back into more day-to-day media work, and just having the association as a potential client when there's a train wreck was nice, but not that nice. So we went back to Washington.
And when was that?
It was January of 1970.
Okay, so you moved back to Washington, and who'd you go to work for there?
Went back to my old law firm.
So Mr. Fletcher wanted you back.
Yes.
And what happened?
Well, I was there and enjoying it and having a great time, flying all over the country, visiting stations, and it was breathing that rarefied air. It was about as good as it gets.
So what happened?
Well, Sandy and I were back there doing the best we could. Sandy was back working for Senator Thurman, and one day, as I said, I received a call from, I believe it was Jack Lee, who told me about the NCAB job.
And so you moved back to North Carolina after you interviewed to take that position.
Correct.
All right. What did your folks think about that?
Well, they were obviously tickled. It worked out great.
So that was the beginning of you with NCAB, and when did you start with the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters?
Well, that was July of 1970.
Oh, wow.
Sandy and I moved back on a weekend, and I opened an office on Monday morning, and Sandy was going to be my office manager until I could interview someone and hire someone. And we just didn't think it would be smart to work together, being married. But it turned out we had a great time, and decided, why should I hire somebody else? This is great.
So were you working for or associated with any law firm at that time?
No, Wade Smith and I had talked, and Harold and Roger and his firm, about hooking up with them. And they were all in favor of it, and I was too. The problem is they had a lease, and they couldn't get out of the lease, and there was no more space for them in the building, so we had to wait until their lease expired, which was 2 years later. So in the meantime, I opened an office by myself and practiced by myself for 2 years.
So let's talk about Raleigh and broadcasting in 1970, 1971. There's no satellite TV. There's no satellite radio. Were there cable companies of any concern, or was it just radio and television at that point?
There were cable companies, and cable companies were a matter of concern. They were considered to be an asset if they were retransmitting your signal, particularly to communities and households that maybe couldn't get a good reception over the air. But they were troubling concern if they were bringing in duplicating programming from out of the market.
So you could have a cable company, but at that time in the law, you had no obligation to carry local signals.
Yes, you did.
You had some obligation.
Yeah, there was an FCC must carry requirement, and there were FCC non-duplication requirements. But some cable operators flirted with those rules, flaunted those rules, and that created problems and friction.
So those were ongoing issues for the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters.
Yes, I was very involved in those.
What other legal issues were there in the 70s for the Broadcast Association and for your members?
Well, the overriding issue for the association out of Washington was excessive regulatory requirements of the FCC, excessive make work, filing reports, keeping records, ascertainment of communities, the filing of the renewal application, and the petitions to deny the renewal of stations. That had become a big issue at that time.
And what did your membership look like then? Who owned radio and TV stations in North Carolina?
Well, mainly the ownership was owner-operator.
So mom and pops.
Mom and pops, for the most part. Television was different because it took a lot of money to go into the television business. But radio stations throughout the state were locally owned by and large. That began to change about 1970. Groups formed and out-of-state companies came into the state and bought stations. North Carolina broadcasters went out of state and bought stations. There's a lot of consolidation that began to take place.
But in the bigger markets and the bigger stations, weren't TV stations kind of a favorite investment by insurance companies?
Yes. Insurance companies gravitated to ownership of television.
And so how did that work? Let's talk about the insurance connection with the Raleigh stations.
Well, the then leading radio station in the market was a 50,000 watt AM station, WPTF. And it was owned by Durham Life Insurance Company, who was based in Raleigh.
And the powerhouses at that time were the 50,000 watt clear channel stations, and PTF was one of those.
Correct.
And what did that mean? What was a 50,000 watt clear channel station? How was that set up by the FCC, and why did that make them so powerful?
Well, they were powerful because they had 50,000 watts. And at nighttime, if they had interference protection, their signal traveled thousands of miles.
So literally, some of those stations you could get border to border?
Yeah, PTF you could pick up in Florida, at Key West at night.
So those were valuable properties.
Yes.
And the insurance companies like those kinds of properties.
Yes.
And what else did they have besides WPTF? Didn't they have some television interests?
Well, later on, I'm not sure, it was in the 1980s, I believe,
70s.
that PTF, that Durham Life bought.
Late 70s.
In the late 70s.
Yeah. Bought a struggling NBC affiliate
With call letters?
in Raleigh. Yeah, Carl Venters was president of Durham Life Broadcasting.
Okay. And what about in Charlotte?
Well, the number one station for years in Charlotte was WBTV, which was owned by Jefferson Pilot Life Insurance Company.
So another insurance company.
Another
owning the
insurance
station.
company.
And those were powerhouses.
And
So-
they owned a 50,000 watt AM and an FM station in Charlotte.
So the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters, within their membership, had both mom and pops and some big players too.
Yes.
So it went on. Do you remember how many members would you have at that time in the 70s and 80s? Was it a big group?
Well, it was a great time for the association because there was a great interest in having workshops and meetings where the FCC's rules were explained and station owners and managers could learn what they needed to do to comply. A great opportunity to network and meet other broadcasters and do deals. So the association's convention was well attended. Many of those owner-operator stations, the wife or the spouse would be a member of the board of directors. So the spouse could come to the convention. It's all tax deductible. And so you had 300 people at an NCAB annual convention. And the conventions would start on Sunday evening or maybe Sunday afternoon with a golf tournament and go through Monday and Tuesday and end typically Wednesday at noon or after a brunch. But, and they were always held at that time in October.
Now, you had mentioned that you had a kind of a mix of mom and pops that owned radio stations and the TV stations in the bigger markets particularly. You had some insurance ownerships. What was happening to radio those days? You said there were some groups forming, people from outside buying up in multiple stations. What was the landscape for radio stations? We'd mentioned the 50,000 watt AMs. Seems to me like in the 70s, FM was coming into its own.
Everybody knew that FM had a lot of advantages over AM in terms of the fidelity of the signal. People thought it was more suitable for music. And a lot of FM stations were experimenting with very light commercial load and music and new genres of music. And people began to pay attention to FM.
If you owned an AM station, could you also own an FM station at that time?
Yes.
So you could have both. And was that typically what happened?
Well, it happened in a lot of cases. Most people regarded their FM stations as something nice to have for the future, one day maybe, but not worth very much right now.
Talk to us about the groups and the owners. Of course, it was changing, the 70s and the 80s. Who were some of the people in North Carolina that owned stations that formed groups and they were getting started?
Well, Durham Life, we discussed, Jefferson Pilot.
So those insurance companies, they bought more properties.
Well, over time, yes, they did.
What about individual owners? Were there any names that people would recognize that started buying stations?
Well, two guys over in the western part of the state, Bob Hilker and Bill Rollins, began to buy small market radio stations and were doing well. George Beasley, who had started with a station in Goldsboro, began to buy stations inside the state and outside. Don Curtis from Bessemer City, so a radio broadcaster, began to buy a number of small market stations.
And these buyers, how did they typically get started in the business?
Well, it was interesting. It's interesting you asked, because in those days, my observation was that most of the broadcasters, those in radio, had started either on the air as disc jockeys or in sales. And as a result, they were colorful personalities. Very extroverted, friendly, warm.
Entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Television was always more buttoned down. A lot of the guys in television had started in radio. But it changed over time as groups formed, and the skills required to run a group were different than skills required to run a hometown radio station. You had budgets, and you had boards of directors and investors, projections, and a lot of things that weren't all that important. They were nice, but the real skill set required for success began to change.
Well, as the NCAB membership grew, you were one attorney. What happened as things grew?
Well, I was very fortunate. My dream was that if I did a good job representing the association, then members of the association would hire me to be their station lawyer. And that happened.
So not only were you representing the trade association, you also got some work representing individual groups and individuals.
Yes.
That sounds like an awful lot of work for one person.
Well, it was. I worked very hard and was fortunate to hire good people. And we now have in the law firm about 15 lawyers who do media law.
But at some point in time, you went from being Wade Hargrove attorney to you teamed up and added some people. When did that happen?
Well, as I said, I practiced by myself starting in July of 1970. And in January of 1972, I joined Wade Smith and Harold Tharrington and Roger Smith, and we formed the firm Tharrington, Smith, and Hargrove. So there were 4 of us. And then we started hiring lawyers.
And your part of it was the broadcast part. You had mentioned that Wade Smith was more of a criminal attorney and the other attorneys handled other types of cases as well. But your specialty was broadcasting.
Correct. But I did, a lot of other things.
And how long were you with Tharrington, Smith, and Hargrove?
For 20-some years.
Oh my gosh.
In 1995, I opened an office in Raleigh for Brooks, Pierce, and McClendon, which was a Greensboro blue chip corporate law firm that was interested in having a presence in Raleigh. And I had known several of those partners and worked with them on matters. And they made an offer, and I joined them, and the media lawyers came with me. We had, I think, 4 lawyers at that time. And that's proved to be a very good move.
And as part of your practice, you've always been very good and you've always been very engaged. From your days of defeating the law that would have passed truth as not being a defense of libel as being strong in legislative matters.
Yes, I never set out to be a lobbyist or to do legislative work, but when you represent an industry, you invariably get involved in legislation and the policy issues affecting the industry. And I've enjoyed that enormously.
So in 1995, you open an office for Brooks Pierce, which is a blue chip Greensboro law firm, and they want to expand into Raleigh, and that is kind of a takeoff pad for you to hire more attorneys and become more involved strictly in broadcasting.
Yes.
Tell us how that worked. You have several people that you hired, Mark Prack, others. Tell us about those people and how that expanded.
Well, Mark was the first person. Mark is from California. He was a law student at Duke. He had gone to undergraduate school at Duke. He was interested in media law, and he applied for a summer job his first year of law school at Duke. And I liked him. I thought he had a real passion for the business, and he joined us for the summer, did a great job, and we extended an offer to him to come back. He thought it would be good to get experience in Washington, and he wanted to work with Dick Wiley, so I called Dick to put in a plug for him, told Dick I was calling against my own self-interest, but if Mark ultimately decided to practice law with us and had always felt that he missed the boat by not spending time in Washington, that would be a mistake. So I think it would be good for him. So he interviewed in Washington. He didn't get a job, but he got a job with a big law firm in Los Angeles. So he worked in Los Angeles the second summer of law school, and then joined us after he graduated from law school.
So you had two lawyers, you and Mark Pratt, and you expanded even more because your duties not only for NCAB became more, you started taking on other trade associations.
Yes. And we hired Co Ramsey, Charles Marshall, David Kushner, Elizabeth Spainhour, Stephen Hartzell, Tim Nelson.
And your great work on behalf of broadcasters, word spread. And you had other associations that contacted you. And what are some of the ones that you became engaged with besides the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters?
Well, the North Carolina Cable TV Association kept trying to hire me to be their executive director and counsel.
How would you do that? How could you represent broadcasters and cable operators with the issues that they often might not agree upon?
Well, I kept saying that very thing to the cable guys. And finally they said, well, why don't we have a deal? You represent us on cable issues, and if there's a conflict with broadcasting, we won't object. You represent to your representing broadcasting.
And that worked out.
And I went to the NCAB board and asked for permission, and the board said yes, as long as that's the deal. And that's worked out perfectly fine, as far as I can tell.
So you not only represented the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters, you represented the North Carolina Cable Television Association.
Right.
But you added some other broadcast associations.
Well, I did. The Virginia broadcasters hired me to be their counsel. The Ohio Association of Broadcasters did. The ABC Television Affiliates Association hired me to be their general counsel, and the NBC Affiliate Association.
And in addition to that, as you said, all of this worked because you represented broadcast associations, you knew the broadcasters, and oftentimes you got work with their groups, and you worked for some small operators as well as some big broadcast groups. Tell us about some of those.
Well, the nice thing about representing trade associations is that you have a high visibility within the association's industry. So as a result of those associations, I've been fortunate again to be hired by companies in the business and hired by a lot of radio and TV stations in North Carolina. Been Time Warner's lawyer for North Carolina for years and years, a number of cable associations, and all these are on issues where broadcasters have no position, no conflict. And the national associations have given me an identity with out-of-state broadcast groups and have been hired by a number of those. The Hearst Corporation is one. Scripps Media is another. Just a lot of work over the years. The News Dispatch Company based out of Columbus, Ohio.
So you became one of the top broadcast law firms in the country, very well recognized, and really had an A-list of clients.
Well, we've certainly had an A-list of clients. Leave it to others to characterize whether we're at the top or the bottom.
And let's talk about, during this time, the 70s, the 80s, 90s, what were some of the big issues that you worked on? What are some of the things that were real challenges?
Well, in the 70s, the overriding concern, as I mentioned earlier, for radio and TV stations was excessive regulation by the FCC. It was very evident in the area of political broadcasting. Regulations about the rates that stations can charge candidates, about the equal opportunity law, the personal attack rule, the fairness doctrine, all of those issues. Employment law became an important part of communications regulation as well. The FCC felt that it needed to have its own equal opportunity employment regulations apart from the EEOC. So that was contentious. We worked on all of that stuff, rulemaking proceedings at the FCC, legislation in Congress, and then specific cases involving stations where they had been subject to complaint by various parties. As I also mentioned, the renewal of station license.
So all the rules and regulations, constantly something going on, getting your licenses renewed, fighting off something in the legislature, dealing with issues at the level of the FCC, a lot of different things. But your work really didn't stop there. You know, your alma mater, UNC Chapel Hill, you continue to be involved with a lot of things there, as well as a lot of community things, much like many other broadcasters and broadcast representatives. Tell us about some of the things that you've participated in. We can go down a list of things. I mean, you've been on a lot of boards, but a lot of them have to do with things associated with University of North Carolina, foundations. The list goes on and on. What are some of those that you really are proudest of?
Well, I'm a big Tar Heel fan. I attribute everything to the time I spent at Chapel Hill, and I've always been willing to give back and to work for the university, and became aware and started fully appreciating the fact that while the state supports the universities, the public universities, it's not enough to sustain it. The public universities, just like private universities, are totally dependent upon private donations. So I've been working with UNC to help raise money. Was asked to serve on the Board of Trustees and was elected chair of the Board of Trustees at Chapel Hill.
Well, those are pretty important positions.
Well, I've very honored to have been asked and thoroughly enjoyed my service to the university.
Let's talk for a minute about what you do in your spare time.
Well, I like to play the pedal steel guitar, the 5-string banjo, and the regular guitar.
And you've got a band that you and an old friend from law school that also was a law partner, Mr. Wade Smith, and others played for in years. Tell us about your band.
Well, when I was in law school, Wade Smith and I were there at the same time for a year, and we started picking together, and we performed for law school functions. Had a great time doing it, and then when after he graduated, we would get together on football weekends, and after the games, we would go at somebody's house and we would grill steaks and have a great time picking and singing.
But you had a band, and they were pretty well known here in town, and you still play now.
Well, when I moved back, we formed a band called Bloomsbury. It's named after an old city park in Raleigh that no longer exists, but it was right over here, across the creek. And in the band are Wade Smith, Mel Williams, who is a retired minister. Mel sang in the Yale Glee Club. And a woman named Lemma Mackey. Her husband is a lawyer. And we formed the band and started performing for different groups and cut a record. Had a wonderful time, get together once a week and pick and sing, and our spouses were good friends with each other. And we just had a wonderful time for years. Traveled up and down the East Coast. Lemma, the woman, sadly passed away. And the band went inactive for a while. And then we added John Crumpler, who's a guitar player. John is an investment banker, went to Harvard, was a quarterback for the Harvard football team, very well-rounded guy, and has a nice voice and great guitar player. He joined us, and we started asking one of Wade Smith's daughters to sing with us, and she and her husband joined us. Her husband plays a harmonica, and he's very good. He could make a living playing for Willie Nelson.
I don't believe I need that. And you play banjo, guitar, pedal steel guitar, a lot of different instruments.
Well, yeah, I don't play any of them well, but I play them enough to have a good time.
And when you weren't playing in the band, you also had a family. And let's talk about your two sons and what they do.
Well, yes, Sandy and I have two boys. Both, we're very proud of both of them. Both are good boys. They're grown. Both went to UNC at Chapel Hill, and both are lawyers. The oldest one is Wade as well. He lives in Honolulu, and he has a 8-year-old son. Our youngest is 3 years out of law school. His name is Drew, and he lives in Raleigh. He's married, and they have a 2-year-old daughter and are expecting another child in December. And he's a lawyer. He's with the State Department of the Environment. Both of our sons are environmental lawyers.
Oh, my gosh.
Couldn't interest them in media stuff.
Didn't like media law, but they liked the others. Well, let's go back to your law practice for a minute. And let's talk about some of the things. And I want to ask you some questions about some interesting cases. You know, you've testified in front of numerous congressional committees. You've lobbied on the Hill. When you go into offices, you're well known in your introductions. You've been named by the National Law Journal as one of the nation's 10 leading media telecommunication lawyers. You're consistently listed in Best Lawyers in America, Super Lawyers, Preeminent Lawyers, and other rankings. Tell us about what you think some of the biggest issues that you have testified on or been faced with during your career in representing broadcasters.
Well, that's a great question, Mike. It's a tough question. They all seem to be the biggest issues at the time.
Retransmission consent was a very big issue when it came along.
And still is. It's sort of died down now, but it's there, and it will pop back up again. Political broadcasting. I think it's a little more rational than it was at one time in the 70s. I mean, I think the FCC's regulatory scheme for that has improved. Equal opportunity employment, big issue. The renewal of stations and the hassle stations have to go through the regulatory legal hassle and expense for renewal. That's gotten better, but it still lurks. Right now, Congress and the FCC struggled for years trying to figure out what to do about cable TV. First of all, whether to regulate it. It sort of looked like a media company in the early days, but then it sort of looked like a utility. They strung wires along public streets, rights of way. And the FCC decided it didn't have jurisdiction under the 34 Communications Act to regulate cable. Congressional hearings were held. There were conflicts between broadcasters and cable. And in 1966, the FCC reversed course and decided that it does have jurisdiction to regulate cable and adopted a comprehensive scheme of cable regulation, including must-carry requirements, that is, requirement that local stations be carried, program exclusivity protections against the importation of out-of-market duplicating programming, and the FCC and Congress continue to struggle with cable and what their appropriate regulatory model should be. And then satellite came along, and the questions were, how do you regulate it? The regulation there was largely modeled after the cable, where applicable, cable regulations. And then the internet came along. And the sense was, well, it's not cable. It's certainly different than cable, but on the other hand, it's very much like cable. It's got wires, and it can bring in programming or transmit programming worldwide. So the FCC and Congress have been struggling with the question of how to regulate, or whether to regulate at all, the internet. So all of those issues are life or death issues for the respective media industries. And getting the regulatory requirements fine-tuned and in balance is a challenge. You regulate too much, you can undercut the economic foundation of the business and the industry and destroy it. If you don't regulate enough, you can let one industry dominate and confiscate the other. It's a real tension. People of goodwill, smart people, have struggled with those issues for years.
How many years were you the attorney for the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters?
46 years.
46 years. Wow. You're a member of their Hall of Fame. You're a recipient of the North Carolina Order of the Longleaf Pine. You've received their Distinguished Service Award. Just about everything. That has been a fantastic run.
Well, it's been great. Been a great experience, personal and professional.
Tell us your favorite Senator Helms story.
Well, I shared earlier my favorite experience with the senator. he helped NCAB defeat that terrible bill.
And that was before he was a senator.
Yeah. But he was controversial at that time. But I knew he would be popular with the conservative rural legislators in particular. And he was. And when he said this is bad, it had credibility with them, much more so than having some lawyer say it's bad.
So, was he helpful after he became senator to broadcasters?
Well, we didn't really. There were times when there were content regulations or talk of regulating content in Washington that I would call on him to make a phone call here and there, and he was helpful, but not strategic like on the libel bill.
Okay. Any story about a broadcaster? Tell us about the Beasley Group. George Beasley was an elementary school principal?
Well, he was a principal at Meadow School in Meadow, North Carolina, which is between Raleigh and Newton Grove. It's a little crossroads. And the FCC allocated a AM channel to Benson, which was nearby. He applied and received that grant. And he owned that station, and then he bought a little AM station over in Goldsboro. And he stopped being a high school or a school principal. I thought it was a high school. And moved to Goldsboro, became active in the community, was chairman of the local board of education, and then started buying stations. Bought one in Fayetteville, which he still owns. Bought one in Kinston. And he ultimately bought WNCT FM. And I think he owns a station down in Newbern. I'm not absolutely sure.
But he really built an empire. Beasley Broadcasting became a big...
And his company, Beasley Broadcasting, is now publicly traded. Mm-hmm. And he started out with small market stations, and he owned some large market stations. Station in Miami. I think he bought one in Los Angeles. Seems that I think he may have sold that, but I could be wrong. But very successful in the radio business. And I think he owns one in Philadelphia.
And from Goldsboro area, North Carolina.
Yes, well, but now he lives in Naples, Florida.
Mm-hmm.
His corporate headquarters are in Naples. And his daughter is the CEO of the company. And he's got a couple of boys, sons, who are active in the business.
Tell us about the Curtis Media Group. That's another North Carolina group.
Well, Don Curtis grew up in Bessemer City, a little west of Charlotte. Worked in radio in high school and was interested in radio. Went to UNC at Chapel Hill and first got in the cable TV business in the early days of cable and built the cable system in, I believe, Kings Mountain, Gastonia. And then bought the radio station in Bessemer City and then bought 2 or 3 more small market stations. And he now owns WPTF and lives in Raleigh. And I've been told Don is the biggest privately owned radio. His company, Curtis Media, is the biggest privately owned radio company in the country.
And lives here in North Carolina.
Yes, lives right around the corner. He's a good guy. He's passionate about broadcasting.
Well, what else do you want to tell us?
Well, the thing about broadcasting that has always been interesting to me is that the personalities are interesting. The people are interesting. It's been part of the fun of being involved with the state association. You get to meet a lot of different people you otherwise would not meet. And you get exposed to a lot of management styles that you otherwise wouldn't get exposed to. And make a lot of friends. And some of the people I've met have become some of my closest personal friends. Just interesting personalities and fun to be around, and we share a common interest in broadcasting.